Hi, Ozzy here. There's an age-old theological question about the nature of omnipotence, of being all-powerful, that one hears repeated within the great debate. And that question is, could God create a rock so heavy even he can't lift it? The question is presented as a challenge, a dilemma. If God can create a rock of a mass so great he could not lift it, then he wouldn't be omnipotent, because there'd be an allegedly logically conceivable task, namely lifting that particular rock he created, that he could not accomplish. On the other hand, if he can't even create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it, then he's not omnipotent, because it means that there's, again, something that's allegedly logically conceivable to do that he can't do. This is supposed to illustrate a problem with the very concept of divine omnipotence. In this video, I want to explain why this is not a good objection to the concept of omnipotence or the concept of an omnipotent God. But before I do that, it's perhaps worth understanding that this question has been around a very long time. And in recent hangouts and videos, I've heard some theists and apologists suggest and outright declare that the only thing which motivates the question is a person's atheism and a desire to deny God's existence. And this is incorrect. In fact, this question has been asked by religious philosophers and theologians since at least the 6th century, during which time there weren't any atheists running around. And it's even one which medieval theologians, including even St. Thomas Aquinas, grappled with as they sought to work out what the concept of omnipotence means, what it implies and doesn't imply, what the limits of omnipotence are, if any, and what this concept could tell us about God. For instance, medieval Christian theologians debated if divine omnipotence meant God could do the impossible. Some theologians, such as Peter Damian, who was an 11th century contemporary of the great St. Anselm of Canterbury, argued that God, because he's omnipotent and created the world and the way the world operates, including logic itself, that God must transcend logic and not be bound by it. We, the argument went, are bound by logic because we were created as part of a logical creation. But God, being the author of this logical world, is not subject to it, and as such can, if he so chooses, violate logic. We just wouldn't be able to grasp it when he did, but that failure of apprehension on our part would impose no constraint on God's nature or his abilities. This medieval Christian view had a name. It was called the doctrine of created eternal verities, referring to how, as they saw it, God created all of the timeless verities, or logical truths as we'd call them today. What we see today as logical or necessary truths, so the argument would go, are truths literally created by God, every bit as much as matter was created by God. And it was a hotly contested scholastic debate. Indeed, many of us in the great debate today are acquainted with an argument that is a legacy of this medieval controversy which persisted for centuries about the doctrine of created eternal verities and the nature of omnipotence. That argument was famously put forward by St. Anselm, his famous ontological argument for God's existence. That's the argument, you will recall, which famously defines God as something that than which no greater being could be conceived. You see, there weren't any atheists running around in the 11th century of Christian Europe, but there were Christian theologians who thought that God was very omnipotent, indeed so omnipotent that he could, as the creator and author of the timeless verities of logic and math and geometry, violate them. And one of the troubling implications of this particular view of divine omnipotence and created eternal verities was that God, if he chose to, could cease to exist. And then if he wanted to, he could exist again. Contradictory? Well, sure, But on this view of omnipotence, contradictions were not a limiting factor for such an omnipotent God. But some Christian philosophers, St. Anselm among them, found this worrisome and unpalatable. So he put forth his ontological proof of God so as to refute this worrisome possibility that God could cease to exist. God, St. Anselm concluded, using his famous ontological argument, was not just logically necessary, but ontologically and metaphysically necessary, and so could not fail to exist, even for an instant. Now, these religious philosophers and theologians were debating questions which might seem rather confused and quaint by our standards, but they were struggling to come to grips with what the concept of omnipotence means, how to define it, what it implies about God, and what the limits of omnipotence were. And the "could God create a rock so heavy even he can't lift it" question was debated in that scholastic and theological context. It was not originated by some godless person determined to deny God's existence. And so the question does not presuppose the impossibility of omnipotence, nor the non-existence of God. However, nowadays, some people do present this question as a challenge to people of Abrahamic faiths who typically affirm that their God is omnipotent. It's also worth mentioning that the majority of theists today would reject the doctrine of created eternal verities, though there are still some small number who would affirm that it's correct. So most theists today would insist that God does not transcend logic, and that therefore anything we say about God's capacities and powers and nature must conform to logic, must be compatible with logic. And so in what follows, I will be operating on that more common modern-day assumption. When people, typically theists, but not just them, try to rebut the rock so heavy even God can't lift it objection to divine omnipotence, they sometimes will say that the challenge demands that God do what's logically impossible. And in so doing, they often incorrectly state where that impossibility lies. Apologists will sometimes say that the very idea of a rock created too heavy to lift is somehow intrinsically contradictory or a logical impossibility. But that's not what they should be arguing. Obviously, there is nothing illogical or self-contradictory about the concept of creating something so heavy it can't be lifted. In fact, not only is that possible, but it's something any of us can do. Anyone on a mild winter's day can make a snowball, roll it along the snow-covered ground to make a snow boulder so large and heavy that he or she can't lift it. So the concept of creating an object so heavy you can't lift it is not, in and of itself, logically incoherent. It's not like anyone has asked God to make a square circle, which is something that no being can do, and presumably God couldn't do either. Rather, the contradiction is not a manifest self-contradiction like a square circle. It's quite unobvious. It has to do with the very concept of omnipotence itself, and the fact that if a being were omnipotent, it would mean that it could do everything that is doable, everything that is logically possible to do. What has to be borne in mind here is the rock too heavy objection doesn't challenge the existence of a God, but rather seeks to challenge the omnipotence of a God, not the existence of a God, by way of showing that there's something which can be done, which God can't do, or else showing that the concept of omnipotence itself is incoherent. If there really were an omnipotent being, however, it could create a rock of any mass, and it could lift any rock no matter its mass. An omnipotent being, by hypothesis, couldn't fail at either task. That is, such a being cannot be able to fail to be able to do both. I know that's confusing, but I'll explain. An omnipotent being, by hypothesis, is incapable of not succeeding in anything it undertakes, so long as that undertaking is logically possible. In other words, the only thing an omnipotent being is incapable of is failing to succeed at anything, which is logically possible. But the challenge, can God create a rock he can't lift, asks if an omnipotent being could succeed at failing to do something. Specifically, could it fail to lift that heavy rock it created, which by hypothesis it could not if it's omnipotent. And that's the problem for the person presenting the rock too heavy challenge to a theist. It's asking if a being which, by definition, can't fail at anything, could succeed at creating something it can't lift. Thus, the question misrepresents matters by characterizing an ability or an accomplishment as if it were an inability or failure of accomplishment. Since when is being able to do something, indeed being able to do everything logically possible, an inability or an indication of a lack of power? It smacks a little of telling someone who's just scored 100% on an exam that he or she has failed because the person got all the answers correct and hence failed to get any wrong answers. So why, when we ask the question, could an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy even it couldn't lift it, does it seem like there's some sort of failure going on? It's because the question is ill-posed. The expression, could God create a rock he could not lift, makes it sound like it's talking about some sort of failure on his part, an incapacity. But what exactly is this being supposedly failing at here? Let's consider that question again. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? No, he can't create that rock. Not that rock. Why not that rock? Because by hypothesis, he can lift any rock he creates, and by hypothesis, he can create a rock of any mass. Every rock. Which means the expression rock too heavy for him to lift isn't a rock that could exist. That's an impossible rock. The question presupposes, therefore, that there's some vast set of conceivable or logically possible rocks of every possible mass, and that among that set of all logically possible rocks is at least one rock that God could create and yet not be able to lift. Now, among that set of all possible rocks, of all possible masses, there are very many that you and I couldn't lift. But if an omnipotent being existed, there would be no rock it couldn't lift. It could lift each rock in that set, no matter its mass, and no matter how many rocks are in the set of all possible rocks, even an infinity of them. And as such, there simply would not be a rock that fits the description of a rock too heavy for the omnipotent being to lift. It's not that there's some rock missing from the set of all possible rocks which such a being couldn't create. An omnipotent being can, by hypothesis, create every possible rock. But because it can lift every rock possible, there just isn't one that can be correctly described as unliftable by an omnipotent being. In other words, there's no such rock possible, not for that being. The concept of an omnipotent being precludes there being a rock that fits such a description. So, can God create a rock he can't lift? Absolutely not, because no rock fits that description. But when we answer no to that question, it sounds, because we've answered in the negative, like God's failing to do something, unable to do something. But in fact, the only thing he's failing to do is create a logically impossible rock, while being able to create and lift every logically possible rock. So when you answer no to the question, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it, you're actually answering yes, he can lift any rock he creates, and he can create a rock of any mass. If God can create a rock of any mass, and he can lift every one of those, exactly which rock is being talked about that he can't lift? There are no other rocks left in logical space. Every possible rock is creatable and liftable by hypothesis. As such, no rock could be truly described as created by God but unliftable when it comes to such a being. As such, this question is an instance of being befuddled by language. The question is, in fact, asking for something impossible for an omnipotent being by asking him to create an impossible object. The question demands that an omnipotent being fail at something, lifting a specific rock which it created, which is only logically possible for a non-omnipotent being, such as you or myself, to do, but utterly impossible for an omnipotent being. Consequently, if God can't create a rock of any size, then he's not omnipotent. And if he can't lift every one of those rocks he created, then he's not omnipotent. That's all true. But if he can do both, as presumably an omnipotent being should be able to do, then that means there's no such thing possible as an unliftable rock to such a being. And so he can't create a rock too heavy for him to lift, because that expression, a rock too heavy for him to lift, doesn't refer to anything that could even exist. An omnipotent being could create rocks too heavy for you to lift, or for me to lift, but it couldn't create rocks that it itself can't lift. And the reason it can't do that is because, by hypothesis, it's an omnipotent being and so can lift any rock it creates. The question just makes it sound like God's failing at something. But ask yourself, what is this omnipotent being allegedly failing to accomplish? It's failing at having an incapacity. It's unable to not be able to lift any rock it can create. The only thing an omnipotent being is failing at in this challenge is failing. In other words, it's succeeding at doing what only an omnipotent being could do, and so the only thing it's failing at is being non-omnipotent. So the rock too heavy challenge to the concept of omnipotence suffers from two problems. It assumes there exists some logically possible object, an unliftable created rock, which couldn't exist if an omnipotent being existed. And it misconstrues what would in fact be a display of omnipotence as some sort of incapacity or failure of power. So, unless your concept of omnipotence includes that an omnipotent being be capable of being non-omnipotent, then one should not be advancing this as an objection to the concept of omnipotence or an omnipotent God. Now, it needs to be said that there are definitions of omnipotence which, upon close scrutiny, are problematical. Some are completely incoherent. And there are good arguments to be advanced for why certain definitions of omnipotence are logically incompatible with other alleged divine attributes, such as omnibenevolence, being all good, and omniscience, knowing everything that's knowable. But the rock too heavy challenge is not one of those arguments. Okay, that's it for now. I hope this helps, and thanks very much for watching.